Ever wondered what could be hiding behind the walls of that perfect apartment? Some places come with more than just rent. They have dark secrets, eerie whispers, and strange happenings that you can't explain. I'm Warlock, and welcome to Mysterrifying. I've heard some chilling stories about tenants who learned this the hard way. Do you like spooky stories? Then hit like, subscribe the channel, and tell me in the comments which stories fascinates you the most. They say when you live alone, you start noticing things you wouldn't with someone else around. Noises you can't explain, shadows where there shouldn't be any. But what if it's not just your mind playing tricks on you? What if something is watching, waiting, from the other side? I always wanted to live alone. The thought of having my own space, free from the demands of roommates or family, was something I craved for years. So when I found a cheap apartment in an old building downtown, I didn't hesitate. The landlord seemed overly eager to rent it out, but I chalked it up to the neighborhood's bad reputation. I was too excited to care. The apartment had a strange layout. A long hallway led to the bedroom, with an old floor-length mirror fixed to the wall midway down. The mirror was cracked slightly at the top corner, but it added character to the place. Still, there was something about it. I couldn't explain why, but every time I walked past it, I felt compelled to glance into it, as if expecting to see something, or someone, behind me. Everything felt fine at first. Then, small things started happening. I'd wake up to find my closet door ajar when I knew I had closed it. Lights flickered in the hallway even though the electrician said the wiring was fine. I told myself it was just the building's age. But one night, I was brushing my teeth, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the mirror. It wasn't me. I froze, staring at the glass. The cracked corner seemed to shimmer slightly, and I swore I saw a shadow dart across the reflection of the hallway. I turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. My heart pounded as I leaned closer to the mirror. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the next night, I heard whispers. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the faint sound of murmuring. At first I thought it was my neighbors, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the mirror. I grabbed my phone for light and cautiously stepped into the hall. The whisper stopped. Then, a knock, not at the door, from inside the mirror. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I called the landlord and demanded to know if anyone else had complained about the apartment. He hesitated before saying, "It's an old building. Noises happen," but I could hear the strain in his voice. He was lying. Things escalated quickly after that. The whispers turned into groaning, and I started waking up with scratches on my arms. The mirror seemed darker, almost like it absorbed the light around it. I tried to cover it with a sheet, but the next morning, the sheet was on the floor, neatly folded. Desperate, I did some research about the building. I found an article from decades ago about a man who used to live in my apartment. He was a recluse, obsessed with mirrors. Neighbors claimed he believed they were gateways to another world. He vanished without a trace, but not before scratching cryptic symbols into the wood around the mirror's frame. I checked the frame that night, and sure enough, faint carvings lined the edges. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I whispered, "Who are you?" into the mirror. At first, nothing happened. Then, the surface of the glass rippled like water. A shadowy figure appeared, its face obscured, but its eyes were clear. They were mine. Before I could scream, the figure whispered, "You let me in." The mirror shattered. When I looked around, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The hallway stretched endlessly, dimly lit by a sickly green glow. I turned to run, but every direction led me back to the mirror. Only now, the reflection wasn't mine. It was my apartment, and someone else living my life. And now, I'm still here, watching, waiting. Whoever reads this, don't look in the mirror. Don't let them in. They warned me about apartment 6B. The neighbors wouldn't even say its number out loud, and the landlord dodged every question about its past. But cheap rent and desperation make you ignore a lot of red flags. I should have listened. Because now, I don't think I'll ever leave. I moved into 6B after a nasty breakup and a series of bad decisions. It was small, dingy, and smelled faintly of mildew. But it was mine. I thought it was a fresh start. The first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet the building was. No chatter, no footsteps, not even the hum of an appliance, just silence. The second thing I noticed was the closet. It was built into the far corner of the bedroom, tall and narrow with a peeling white door that didn't quite close all the way. I didn't think much of it at first, but every time I entered the room, my eyes were drawn to that door, just slightly ajar, like it was waiting for something. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. Then, one night as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint whisper, low and raspy, coming from the direction of the closet. At first, I told myself it was just the wind. The old building had plenty of cracks and creaks, and I was exhausted. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they were definitely coming from the closet. I tried to ignore it, but sleep became impossible. One night, I mustered enough courage to shine a flashlight into the closet. It was empty. Just a few shelves, a rod for hangers, and peeling wallpaper. Still, I slammed the door shut and pushed my dresser in front of it, hoping to block out the sound. But the next morning, the dresser was back in its original spot, and the closet door was ajar again. That's when I started hearing my name. The whispers, once indistinct, began calling to me. Come here. Please. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to chill me to the bone. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom entirely, opting for the lumpy couch in the living room instead. But the whispers followed me there too. I confronted the landlord, demanding to know if anyone else had experienced anything strange in the apartment. He avoided eye contact and mumbled, "It's just an old place. Nothing to worry about." I pressed him harder, and he finally admitted that the last tenant had moved out suddenly, leaving all their belongings behind. People spooked themselves sometimes, he said, but his hands were shaking. That night, the whispers turned into knocking. It started softly. A single tap. Then two. Then a relentless pounding coming from the closet. My heart raced as I stood frozen in the living room. Then I heard a new sound. The bedroom door creaking open on its own. I couldn't stay away. Something was drawing me back to that closet. I walked into the bedroom, trembling, and saw that the door was now wide open. There was a smell, damp earth, and something metallic, like blood. Inside, the wallpaper had peeled completely away, revealing words scratched into the wood beneath. They were messy, frantic letters that read, "Help me," over and over again. I should have run, but instead I reached in, feeling along the back wall. My fingers brushed against something cold, something that moved. A hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, pulling me forward with an unnatural strength. I screamed and yanked myself free, stumbling backward. The hand disappeared into the darkness, but before the door slammed shut on its own, I saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly, watching me from the void. Now, I can hear them everywhere. In the walls and the pipes, even in my own head. They're waiting for me to open the closet again. But I won't. I hope. If you ever visit apartment 6B, do yourself a favor. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't look in the closet. And whatever you do, don't let them call your name. It wasn't the rent that sold me on the apartment. It was the quiet. In the middle of a noisy city, finding a place where you could hear yourself think felt like a miracle. But I didn't realize that the silence wasn't peaceful. It was watching. When I first moved in, I noticed little things, scratches on the baseboards, faint stains on the walls, and a peculiar draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The landlord said it was an old building and shrugged it off. "It's got charm," he said with a crooked grin. The apartment had a small living room, a cramped kitchen, and a single bedroom. Nothing fancy, but it was enough for me. I unpacked my things, set up my furniture, and by the end of the first night I felt settled. But I didn't notice the smell until the second day. It was faint at first, a damp, earthy odor, like wet dirt and rotting wood. I thought it might be the plumbing, so I called the landlord. He promised to send someone to check it out, but no one ever came. Meanwhile, the smell grew stronger, and then I started hearing noises. It began as faint scuffling, like mice in the walls. I knocked on the plaster a few times, hoping to scare them off, but the sound always returned, louder and closer. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something different, a low, guttural breathing, like someone, or something, was pressed right up against the other side of the wall. I froze, straining to listen. The breathing stopped, replaced by a faint scraping sound as if nails, or claws, were dragging across the inside of the wall. The next day, I decided to investigate. I moved the furniture away from the walls and noticed deep gouges in the plaster, like something had been clawing from the inside. I told myself it was just rats or raccoons, but deep down, I knew better. That night, the noises got worse. I could hear it moving, something large shifting and scraping behind the walls. I tried to ignore it, but when the whispering started, I couldn't pretend anymore. It wasn't just whispers. It was a voice, low, hoarse, and inhuman. "Let me out," it said. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Around 3 a.m., the smell became unbearable. It was stronger than ever, thick and putrid, like rotting meat, and then I saw it. The wall in the bedroom bulged outward, as if something massive was pressing against it from the other side. Cracks spiderwebbed across the plaster, and I heard the voice again, louder this time. "I'm hungry." I ran out of the apartment and spent the night in my car. The next morning I returned with a hammer. I was done being afraid. If there was an animal or some squatter hiding in the walls, I was going to find it and deal with it. I swung the hammer at the bulging section of the wall. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. The smell hit me like a wave, nearly making me gag. I aimed my flashlight into the hole, and what I saw will haunt me forever. It wasn't an animal. It was a creature, twisted and emaciated, with skin stretched tightly over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light, and its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It stared at me, unblinking, before it whispered again, "You shouldn't have looked." It moved faster than I thought possible, clawing at the edges of the hole as I stumbled backward. I grabbed the dresser and shoved it against the wall, barricading the opening. The thing screamed, a shrill, piercing sound that echoed through the entire apartment. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I left everything behind and ran. When I called the landlord, he didn't sound surprised. He just sighed and said, "I told you it was an old building. I don't know what's living in those walls. Maybe it's been there for years, feeding on tenants too scared, or too curious, to leave. All I know is this. If you ever hear scratching in the walls, don't investigate. And for the love of God, don't let it out." The ad said the apartment came with a unique view of the forest beyond the city. What it didn't say was that something in that forest might be watching you back. I moved into the apartment last fall. It was a small place on the edge of town, with big windows that looked out over a dense stretch of forest. I was drawn to the quiet. No noisy neighbors, no blaring traffic, just the soothing rustle of leaves. The first few nights were peaceful. I'd sip tea by the window and watch the treetops sway in the breeze. The moonlight gave the woods a silvery glow, and occasionally I'd spot a deer or a fox darting between the trees. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw something. Someone, standing at the edge of the tree line. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a hiker, or someone who had wandered too far from the trails. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it seemed. The figure was too tall, impossibly thin, with unnaturally long arms that hung limply at its sides. It didn't move, didn't sway like the trees around it. It just stood there, facing my window. I turned off the light, hoping to break its line of sight, but when I peeked out again, it was gone. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. A shadow, a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. Over the next week, I started noticing strange things. Scratches on the glass of my windows, like something had been trying to claw its way in. Faint impressions in the dirt beneath the trees, far too large to belong to any animal. And at night, I felt watched. Like something was out there, just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for me to look. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I sat by the window with the lights off, scanning the tree line. Hours passed, and I saw nothing but the wind shaking the branches. And then, just as I was about to give up, it appeared again. The figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, moving with an unnatural, jerking gait. This time it was closer, close enough for me to see that it had no face. Its head was smooth and featureless, save for two deep, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. It tilted its head upward, as if it could sense me watching, and then it raised one long, bony hand to point directly at my window. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked again, it was gone. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside my apartment building. They were enormous, with clawed toes that sank deep into the earth. I called the landlord, desperate for answers, but he just laughed nervously and said, "People always see weird things out here. It's just your imagination." But I knew it wasn't. That night, I didn't dare sit by the window. Instead, I locked every door and closed every curtain. I tried to sleep, but around midnight, I heard it. The faint tapping of claws on the glass. I froze, too terrified to move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then I heard the faintest whisper. "Look!" I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but through the gap in the middle, I saw it. The man with no eyes standing just outside, its hollow sockets fixed on me. It pressed its long fingers against the glass, leaving streaks of condensation as it mouthed the word again. "Look." I bolted from the apartment that night and never went back. I left everything behind. Clothes, furniture, even my car. Sometimes I think I still see it. In the reflections of dark windows, in the shadows of tall trees, and I know it's waiting for me to look again. If you ever find yourself alone near the woods, close your blinds, and no matter what you hear, don't look. When I first moved into the building, the landlord warned me not to worry about the strange things people said about apartment 4C. "Nobody stays long," he muttered. "But it's just an old building, nothing more." I didn't believe him, but now I wish I'd never taken the key. Apartment 4C was small but clean, with creaky floors and outdated fixtures. It had a strange layout, a long hallway with a door at the end that didn't open. The landlord said it had been sealed years ago, maintenance issues or something like that. I didn't think much of it at the time. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. I unpacked, settled in, and started decorating. But then I started hearing noises, faint hums and clicks coming from behind the sealed door. I figured it was just old pipes or maybe rodents, but it seemed oddly rhythmic, almost like a pattern. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something new. A metallic scraping sound echoed through the hallway, followed by a soft knock on the sealed door. I froze, my heart pounding. Nobody else had access to the apartment. Slowly, I crept toward the hallway, phone in hand for light. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear against it. The knocking stopped, but I could hear something faint, a low, steady hum, like machinery running behind the wall. The next morning, I asked my neighbors about the apartment. They all avoided my questions, exchanging uneasy glances. Finally, an older woman on the third floor told me, "You're not the first to hear it. People say it's not from here." I laughed nervously, but her words stuck with me. That night, I noticed something else. The sealed door looked different. The edges were clean, almost too clean, as if it had been newly constructed. And then there was the light. A faint, bluish glow seeped out from the cracks around the door frame, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. I couldn't resist anymore. Grabbing a crowbar, I pried at the edges of the door until it creaked and groaned. Finally, with one last pull, it swung open. Behind the door wasn't another room or storage space. It was endless. The walls were made of a smooth, metallic material that seemed to ripple under the bluish light. Strange symbols and patterns pulsed across the surface, shifting and changing like living things. The air felt heavy, humming with an energy that made my skin prickle. And then I saw them. At first I thought they were shadows, but they moved against the light. They were tall and slender, with elongated limbs and featureless faces that glowed faintly. They floated, moving with a strange grace, as if they were swimming through the air. One of them turned toward me, though it had no eyes. Somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. A sound filled my ears. Not words, but a feeling like 1,000 thoughts crammed into my mind all at once. I couldn't understand it, but it was overwhelming, almost painful. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. I didn't sleep that night. The hum behind the door grew louder, and the blue light seeped out from the edges, brighter than before. The next morning, I tried to leave the apartment, but the front door wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't open either. I was trapped. I called the landlord, desperate for help, but when he answered, his voice was calm, almost resigned. "You opened it, didn't you?" he said. "I told you not to worry about that room." "What is it?" I screamed. He sighed. "Not what. Who? They've been here longer than us, watching, waiting. That room isn't part of the building. It's part of them." The line went dead. Now, the door isn't just sealed, it's gone. The hallway ends abruptly, as if the wall has always been there, but I can still hear them. The hum, the clicking, the faint whispers pressing into my mind. I don't know how much longer I can stay. The light is starting to seep through the walls, and at night, I swear I can see their shadows moving closer. If you ever find a door that doesn't belong, don't open it. Some things are better left sealed. The first thing I noticed when I moved into apartment 5D was the stain. It was faint, just a pale reddish smudge on the inside of the front door, shaped like a handprint. The landlord brushed it off, saying old tenants didn't take care of the place. I thought it was strange, but I stayed anyway. I wish I hadn't. The apartment was cheap, close to work, and quiet. Too quiet. Even during the day, I never heard a sound from my neighbors. No footsteps, no voices, not even the creak of doors opening and closing. It was like the building was hollow. That first night, I scrubbed at the stain on the door, but no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't come off. I covered it with a coat of paint and told myself it didn't matter. But as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about it. Why only the inside of the door? A few nights later, I came home late from work. As I unlocked the door, I saw it. The handprint was back. Same shape, same size, as though the paint had been scraped away to reveal it again. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe the paint hadn't dried right. I tried not to think about it, but things only got stranger. The next night I woke up to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp knocks, loud enough to echo through the apartment. I jumped out of bed and checked the front door, but no one was there. The handprint, though, was darker now, like fresh blood smeared on the wood. I called the landlord the next morning, demanding answers. He hesitated before saying, "It's just left over from before. Nothing to worry about. Before what? I pressed. He muttered something about a break-in years ago, about the police getting involved, but he was vague. Nothing ever came of it. He said before hanging up. That night, the knocking came again. This time it wasn't just at the front door. It was on the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath my feet. I sat frozen in my bed, clutching my phone, but when I finally worked up the courage to call 911, the noise stopped. The operator didn't take me seriously. "Are you sure it's not just the building settling?" she asked. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The next morning, I decided to look into the apartment's history myself. At the library, I found an old newspaper article about a murder in 5D. A young woman strangled in her own home. The police suspected an ex-boyfriend, but they never found enough evidence to arrest him. The case went cold. The article included a photo of the apartment's front door with a red handprint smeared across it. The victim's blood, according to the report. My blood ran cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. The knocking came back, louder than ever, but this time it was joined by something else. A whisper. "Help me?" It was faint, like a voice carried on the wind, but it was clear. It came from the direction of the front door. I didn't want to look, but I had to. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the handprint on the door was dripping now, fresh and wet. Below it, scratched into the wood, were the words, "He's still here." I slammed the door and backed away, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the closet door in the hallway was ajar. I hadn't opened it. Inside, I found an old shoebox. It was filled with photographs of the murdered woman, all taken from outside her window. The last photo was different. It was of me, taken from outside my own window. I ran out of the apartment that night and never went back. The police didn't find anything when they searched, but they told me the truth. The ex-boyfriend had lived in the building for years after the murder. He disappeared shortly before I moved in. Now, whenever I hear a knock at my door, I freeze, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes it comes knocking. If you hear anything weird at night, don't worry about it. This place has thin walls. The landlord had said, waving off my concerns about the eerie silence of the building. I thought nothing of it then, but now I can't help but wonder if he was warning me. I moved into the apartment with a roommate, Caleb, who was as broke as I was. The place wasn't much, peeling wallpaper, flickering lights, and a weird smell in the hallway that never seemed to go away, but the rent was dirt cheap. The first week was uneventful. Caleb and I split chores and spent evenings complaining about work over greasy takeout. But on the 7th night, things started to get strange. It was small at first. I'd wake up to find the bathroom door open when I was sure I'd closed it. Caleb's keys would vanish, only to show up in bizarre places, like the freezer or beneath the couch cushions. We laughed it off, blaming our shared absent-mindedness. Ghosts, maybe. Caleb joked one night, but I noticed he kept the hallway light on after that. Then came the noises. At first it was faint, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the walls late at night. Caleb insisted it was the pipes, but it didn't sound like water. It sounded alive. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Groggy, I assumed it was Caleb heading to the kitchen, but when I got up for water a few minutes later, I found him fast asleep in his room. The next morning, Caleb seemed distant. He barely ate, and when I asked if something was wrong, he just muttered, "Weird dreams." By the 3rd week, Caleb had changed completely. He stopped going to work, barely spoke to me, and spent most of his time locked in his room. At night, I'd hear him whispering, but when I pressed my ear to the door, I couldn't make out the words. It wasn't English, or any language I recognized. One night, I finally confronted him. "Caleb, what's going on? You've been acting really strange." He stared at me, his eyes hollow and sunken. "It's in the walls," he said. "What's in the walls?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and left the apartment without another word. I didn't see him for 3 days. On the 4th day, I woke up to find his room empty. The bed was made, his clothes were gone, and all his belongings had vanished. It was as if he had never been there. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I contacted his work, and they said he'd quit a week ago. When I called his family, they told me they hadn't heard from Caleb in years, as if he'd been erased. That night, the noises in the walls grew louder. They weren't just hums anymore. They were whispers, frantic and overlapping, coming from every direction. Desperate for answers, I tore open one of the walls in the living room. What I found made my stomach churn. Behind the drywall was a narrow, dark tunnel lined with something that looked like skin, stretched taut and pulsating as if it were breathing. In the center of the tunnel, partially embedded in the wall, was a single, bloodshot eye. It swiveled toward me, unblinking, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. I ran. I left the apartment that night and never looked back. I reported Caleb missing, but the police found nothing. No records, no evidence he'd ever lived with me. The landlord refused to talk, and the building was condemned a month later. I still hear whispers sometimes, faint and distant, as if carried on the wind. And at night, I dream of walls that breathe and tunnels that watch. If you ever move into an apartment with thin walls, be careful, because sometimes it's not your neighbors you're hearing, it's something else, something that's waiting.